Mornings in Pleasantville, Maine, were always shrouded in fog. The chilly air of April caused the old greenhouse's cracked glass to shiver. Mary Williams, who had retired as a social worker 3 years ago at the age of 67, was diligently removing ivy roots spread across the floor with rusty pruning shears. Perhaps it's time this greenhouse welcomed new life. For over 30 years, she faced the challenges of troubled families and children. After retiring, tending to this garden had been her sole daily routine. Having lost her husband, her only daughter Caroline was successful as an investment banker in New York. Despite the overly spacious mansion and garden, Mary enjoyed her tranquil days here. As she attempted to pull out ivy from the gaps in the floorboards, her fingertips touched something hard. Digging through the soil, she found a small metal box buried. When she pried open the rusted hinges, out came a bundle of letters dated 50 years ago and an envelope labeled Carpenter Family Estate. The scent of earth wafted from the yellowed bundle, causing Mary to squint. The Carpenters, once the oldest family in town. Over 30 years ago, one of her challenging cases had involved this family, but now those memories were as vague as the fog. That afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived at her home. The chime rang, and upon opening the door, a woman in her early 30s stood there. She wore a deep blue dress, exuding sincerity with her eyes and a professional demeanor with her shoulder-length hair neatly cut. "Ms. Williams, do you have a moment?" she politely asked. "Yes, may I ask who you are?" "I'm Lily Foster. I work as a counselor at a youth rehabilitation facility." Mary, puzzled by the sudden visit from a stranger, softened her expression upon hearing Lily's identity. Her years as a social worker had instilled a deep trust in those who served in welfare. "Oh, please come in," Mary said with a warm smile. "I'll make some tea. I was just feeling a bit lonely." "Thank you," Lily replied, her expression relieved as she followed Mary into the living room. Sitting on the old floral sofa, she still seemed a bit tense, but Mary's gentle demeanor gradually eased her. "Miss Foster, you had Dr. Jones at the facility, didn't you?" Mary poured tea from the pot, reminiscing. "I often worked with him when I was active." "Yes." Lily's voice brightened. "Dr. Jones spoke highly of you. He admired how deeply you understood the children." "That's kind of him. But that was all in the past." Mary responded calmly, offering Lily a cup. "So, what brings you here today?" Lily accepted the cup with gratitude and began to explain slowly. "Actually, there's a boy at our facility I urgently needed to discuss with you." She took a deep breath before continuing. "Jake Summers, a 15-year-old boy." Lily pulled out a photograph from her bag. The skinny, downcast boy in the photo had dark, wary eyes as if on guard against the whole world. "Jake has been with us for a year now. Before that," she carefully chose her words, "he suffered severe abuse from his stepfather until he was 12. His mother has alcoholism and was rarely home." Mary nodded silently, having seen many children with such haunted eyes in her 30 years. His stepfather was a day laborer on construction sites, struggling with alcoholism, and often locked Jake in the basement over trivial mistakes, sometimes leaving him without food for days. Lily flipped through the records as she spoke. The abuse was discovered thanks to a neighbor's report. One day, she heard Jake's screams and called the police. When officers arrived, they found him in the basement, severely dehydrated. Lily's voice trembled slightly. After being rescued, he acted out violently in his first foster home and had to be moved within 2 weeks. It was the same in the next home. After moving through 5 foster homes, he ended up in our facility. And how is he doing there? Mary asked quietly. He's completely isolated. Lily answered with a deep sigh. He won't speak to anyone, and during counseling sessions, he just silently stares out the window. He doesn't interact with other children at all. Occasionally, he exhibits violent behavior. Has there been any particular incident that might have triggered such behavior? Yes, last month there was a small change. Lily's expression brightened slightly. There's a small flower bed in the facility's courtyard. One morning, I saw Jake watering the daisies when no one else was around. Mary leaned forward, intrigued. The next day, someone had trampled the flowers. Jake was furious and beat up the boy he thought was responsible. But in his eyes, I saw something alive, some emotion. Lily paused, then continued slowly. After that, I looked into his past more closely. The basement where he was abused had a small window, and during police questioning, Jake said that the flower was the only friend I had. So, you took an interest in my garden. Mary looked out at her garden. Yes. Lately, Jake's violence has escalated. If this continues. Lily's words trailed off. Could I perhaps rely on your experience and the healing power of your garden? Mary stood up and slowly walked towards the window. The well-maintained flower beds, the old greenhouse, and the workshop shed had been her sanctuary for healing her own emotional wounds for 30 years. Now, it seemed a new challenge awaited her. Could I meet Jake tomorrow? Yes, of course. The next morning, Mary was up early preparing the greenhouse. She wiped down the old workbench, organized the well-used gardening tools, and spread new straw on the floor. From her many years of experience, she knew that a wounded soul first needed a safe place. Good morning, Ms. Williams. Mary turned around to see Lily arriving in the facility's car. In the passenger seat sat Jake, the boy from yesterday's photograph. The skinny youth, wearing an oversized hoodie, didn't attempt to get out of the car, clutching his knees tightly with his hands. Good morning, Jake. Mary spoke warmly but softly through the slightly open window. It's a beautiful day today. There was no reply. Jake just kept looking down. I won't force you, but if you're interested, would you like to see inside the greenhouse? Mary made the suggestion casually. I'm just getting ready for spring. Lily, noticing a slight movement in the boy's eyes, gently opened the car door, and Jake stepped out, looking tense. Mary could feel the wariness radiating from him. Once inside the greenhouse, Jake's eyes opened a bit wider. The space was lit by the morning sun, filled with the scent of earth and the warmth of old wood. Mary observed him as she slowly moved towards the workbench. I always start tomato seedlings around this time, she explained while showing him the small seeds. They're tiny lives, but with careful tending, they can grow as tall as a person by summer. Jake remained silent, yet his interest in the seeds was evident. Would you like to try growing some? Mary asked gently. We could make a special spot just for you here in the greenhouse. The boy glanced at Mary for a moment. His eyes were a mix of distrust and hope. What about the soil? His voice was faint, but it was indeed Jake who spoke. Lily gasped silently. It was the first time he had initiated conversation at the facility. It's in that shelf, the black soil. Mary responded naturally. But before you use it, it might be good to feel it with your hands. It's important to check the condition of the soil. Jake hesitantly reached out his hand to the soil. When his fingertips touched it, his expression softened slightly. It's soft. Yes, good soil is like this, soft and moist. Mary continued observing quietly as Jake's fingers delicately scooped up the soil. It was a tender, almost reverent movement. Why don't you try using this pot? Put some stones in the bottom first, then add the soil. Mary offered him a small terracotta pot. Jake nodded silently and began the task with clumsy yet earnest movements. As Mary watched Jake work, she also kept an eye on Lily, who seemed restless as she walked around the greenhouse. Especially near the spot where Mary had found the box yesterday, Lily paused several times, looking down at the floor. "Lily, shall I make some tea?" Mary suggested calmly, and Lily snapped back to reality. "Oh, yes. Thank you." As Mary was about to leave, Jake suddenly stopped moving. His body tensed, and his breathing became rapid. "It's okay, I'll be right back." "Jake, why don't you prepare another pot in the meantime?" The boy seemed hesitant at first, but slowly nodded. While preparing tea in the kitchen, Mary's thoughts were racing. Her 30 years of experience gave her an intuition that something was off. She had felt a certain unnaturalness in Lily's behavior. Returning to the greenhouse, she found an unexpected scene. Jake was continuing his work silently, but there was a faint look of peace on his profile. Meanwhile, Lily was casually trying to open a drawer at the old workbench. "That drawer doesn't open," Mary said quietly. "The lock is broken." Lily hastily withdrew her hand. "I'm sorry. I was just looking for some tools. All the tools we need are right here." Mary pointed to the tools on the workbench. At that moment, Jake murmured softly, "Can I plant the seeds?" "Of course." Mary turned back to the boy. "Gently, but make sure they're firm." Jake's fingertips pressed the tiny seeds into the soil. There was none of the roughness that had been evident before. "How about coming here every day until the seeds sprout?" "To water them and check on them," Mary suggested cheerfully. The boy did not respond verbally, but his gentle stroking of the soil above the planted seeds conveyed his agreement. "Then, let's meet here tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Lily interjected. "I'll come too." Mary sensed something more than professional concern in Lily's voice. It was something earnest. "Jake, this is your special place." Mary addressed the boy. "Here, no one will hurt you. I promise." Hearing those words, Jake stopped his hand movements momentarily. For the first time, he looked directly into Mary's eyes. In his gaze, something long shut away seemed to glimpse the light once more. As they were leaving, Jake turned back once more before getting into the car, looking at the greenhouse. It was a soft expression that one could hardly imagine from the boy described earlier. After seeing them off, Mary went to her study and pulled out a file on the Carpenter family from a cabinet neatly filled with 30 years of records. It was from when she was a young social worker. As she flipped through the pages, memories returned, the ugly dispute over the Carpenter family's inheritance and the image of a 4-year-old girl hurt in the midst of it all came vividly back to mind. Could it be? Mary picked up the metal box found the previous day and began carefully checking the documents again. A photo slipped out from the bundle of yellowed papers. In it, a woman held a young girl against the backdrop of a lavish garden. On the back of the photo were the words Elizabeth and Lillian Carpenter. Lillian. Mary held the photo up to the light by the window. The young girl's eyes bore a familiar expression. Just then, the doorbell rang. "Lily?" Mary exclaimed, surprised. "I'm sorry," Lily said, looking unsettled. "After I dropped off Jake at the facility, there was something I just had to tell you. Come inside. I'll listen to what you have to say." Mary led her to the study. As Lily entered, she casually scanned the room, her gaze briefly stopping on an open cabinet. "Ms. Williams, seeing Jake today," Lily began, carefully choosing her words. "I feel that our facility isn't providing him with the care he needs. And? Could we possibly bring him here more often? Maybe 3 times a week." Mary observed Lily's expression carefully. Indeed, there was genuine professional concern, but at the same time, something more personal seemed to lurk behind it. "Lily," Mary started quietly, "what are you really seeking?" At Mary's penetrating gaze, Lily stiffened momentarily. "What do you mean?" "This boy, Jake. Don't you see a reflection of your own past in him?" A heavy silence fell in the room. Outside the window, the evening light dyed the trees red. The greenhouse glass shimmered with the last rays of sunlight. "Come with Jake tomorrow," Mary said gently. "But remember, this garden is a place of truth. A time will come when everything is revealed." Lily looked uncomfortable, then nodded silently and hurried away. Mary watched her back and then gazed again at a photo she had taken from a stack of documents. A greenhouse from 30 years ago. There, Elizabeth Carpenter, now deceased, was embracing a young girl. The girl's eyes strangely resembled Lily's today. The next day, Mary's routine was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. A brand new luxury car roared into the driveway, and the sound of high heels striking the pavement sharply followed. "Mom, it's been a while." Caroline Bradley, clad in a perfectly tailored hairdo and a clearly designer suit, stood out sharply against Pleasantville's serene air. As vice president of a New York investment bank, she was an anomaly here. "That's unusual," Mary said, removing her soil-stained gloves. "If you had let me know in advance." "It's urgent," Caroline interrupted, stepping into the living room. "I have something to discuss about this house and land." Mary recognized a familiar assertiveness in her daughter's expression. It was the same look her late husband had when he made big decisions. "I'll make some tea." "No need, I don't have time." Caroline opened her briefcase and pulled out some documents. "There's a proposal from developers. They plan to develop this area into a luxury residential zone." Mary watched her daughter silently. "They're offering a very generous deal. If we let go of this old house and the unused garden, you could live somewhere more convenient." "I refuse." Mary's voice was calm but firm. "Isn't there any room for consideration?" Caroline's impatience was evident. "I'm deeply involved in this development project. That's exactly why I refuse." Caroline was momentarily lost for words. "What do you mean?" "I know your methods. You wouldn't hesitate to use any means for profit. You're like your father in that way." Mary looked out the window. "But this garden has a different value." At that moment, voices came from the direction of the greenhouse. Jake and the others had arrived for their scheduled time. "Is someone there?" Caroline asked sharply. "A new family." "Family?" Caroline repeated mockingly. "Here we go again. Mom's savior complex." "Caroline." Mary's voice grew stern. "You may not remember, but this garden has healed many hearts. Since I started working as a social worker 30 years ago. I've heard enough." Caroline stood up. "But this isn't the end. I will make sure this development happens." She turned on her heel and stormed out. As the sound of her car's engine faded, Mary sighed and headed towards the greenhouse. On her way, she was immersed in old memories. The days she had spent facing many wounded children in this garden. And the complex relationship with her own daughter, Caroline. It was the summer Caroline turned 10. Her father, James, had been promoted to partner at a major investment bank, and the family had entered a wealthier lifestyle. However, this also began to slowly change the family dynamic. Mary continued working for troubled families and children. She stayed late in the office and was on call over weekends. Meanwhile, James began spending his time at dinners with clients at high-end restaurants and socializing at the golf club. In between, Caroline spent her time alone. A talented tutor was hired, and she was sent to expensive lessons. However, the time she felt her parents' love directly was definitely diminishing. "Mom, will you have dinner with me today?" "I'm sorry. I have a commitment with the children at the facility today." "Dad? Your father has a business dinner." Such conversations became routine. Caroline began to watch from the window more often as her mother spent time in the greenhouse with unfamiliar children. Sometimes, she felt a vague jealousy towards those children. Mary was aware of her daughter's loneliness. But believing that helping other people's children was her mission, she couldn't bend her conviction. Instead, she tried to compensate by giving her expensive gifts and providing a better educational environment. James's sudden death cast a definitive shadow over their relationship. It happened during Caroline's sophomore year in college. He collapsed from a heart attack and never returned. On the day of the funeral, Caroline confronted her mother for the first time with her true feelings. "Why didn't you spend more time with Dad? Why did you prioritize other people's children over your own family?" Those words deeply pierced Mary's heart. Without finding words to return, her daughter walked away from her arms and returned to her university in New York. Since then, Caroline pursued success in the financial world following in her father's footsteps, and Mary immersed herself even more in social work. While they maintained a facade of a harmonious mother-daughter relationship, the emotional gap between them grew year by year. Their communication had become formal, limited to Christmas cards and birthday calls. Caroline was trying to understand her mother's way of life, and Mary was doing the same with her daughter's values, but somewhere along the line, both had given up. Now, as she headed to the greenhouse, Mary was contemplating. What if she had made different choices back then? Yet, she also remembered the smiles of the wounded children. She wanted to believe that her choices had not been wrong. If there was a chance to mend her relationship with her daughter, she would take it, this time for sure. Mary often resolved to do so, but as time passed without opportunity, it felt increasingly futile. With a quiet sadness, Mary reached the greenhouse and opened the door. Jake was already there, beginning his work. Lily was watching him from a distance. "Good morning," Mary greeted gently. Jake nodded silently. His expression was slightly softer than the day before. The seeds he had planted were still dormant in the soil, but the boy was already gently watering the earth. "You water them carefully, don't you?" Mary said with a gentle smile. Last night, after returning to the facility, he checked on his own about the time for watering tomorrow. Lily explained in a low voice. "It was the first time I saw him taking initiative like that." "That's good." Mary watched contentedly as the boy's slender fingers gently touched the soil. At that moment, the sound of a car approached again. Can it be? Sure enough, Caroline had returned. She followed her mother into the greenhouse and froze at the scene inside. Is this the new family? Caroline said sarcastically. A rehabilitation center for troubled youth? Jake's body tensed for a moment. Mary immediately stepped in front of him. Caroline, leave this place. I have a right to know. As an heir to this land. That's not true. Lily stepped forward with a firm yet calm voice. The inheritance of this land isn't determined so easily. Who are you? Caroline demanded. Now is not the time to discuss this, Lily said, looking towards Jake, who was clearly distressed. Always so convenient. At that moment. Leave now. Or I will call the police. Mary's stern voice filled the greenhouse. Caroline, about to retort, swallowed her words at her mother's resolute demeanor. Fine, but this isn't over. After she left, a heavy silence fell over the greenhouse. Jake continued to tremble, his hands touching the soil in front of him. It's okay, Jake. Mary reassured him gently. No one will take your place here. The boy nodded silently, but his gesture carried a hint of agreement. In it, Mary saw a glimmer of hope. Meanwhile, Lily's expression was complex. She pulled an old photograph from her pocket and sighed deeply as if making a decision. Ms. Williams, there's something I need to tell you. Lily handed an old photo to Mary. This is my mother, Elizabeth Carpenter, and me at 4 years old. Mary gasped. It was the same photo she had seen the day before. However, the photo Lily handed over had detailed dates and locations written on the back. Lillian Carpenter. Mary whispered quietly. So you were the girl from that time? Yes. After my parents died, my uncle took the inheritance rights from me as a child. And those documents? Lily's voice trembled slightly. They prove the truth of the inheritance. Mary nodded in understanding. But why did you know I found those documents? Did you know about their existence beforehand? Actually, I've been searching for clues left by my mother for 30 years. Lily's hands trembled as she pulled out the old photo. My mother's diary mentioned that important documents were hidden in the garden greenhouse. Mary gasped. Elizabeth did. Yes. Lily continued, tears welling in her eyes. My mother was sure of the specialness of this garden. That's why she entrusted something important to it. And, strangely, you, whom she trusted most, have been protecting this garden. But why didn't you say anything until now? I only found my mother's diary 2 months ago. Lily explained with a deep sigh. I found it when cleaning out my grandmother's house. And getting a job at the Youth Rehabilitation Center was actually a way to get closer to this garden. Lily paused, closing her eyes as if remembering. Yesterday, when I came to talk about Jake, I was watching from outside the greenhouse. I saw you digging out the metal box from under the floorboards. Can it be? Yes. It was exactly where my mother's diary said it would be. Lily's voice shook. But I couldn't come forward right away. I wanted to earn your trust first. And my desire to help the children was genuine. I believe you, Lily. After all, you are Elizabeth's daughter. Mary smiled warmly. It's only natural you have a kind heart. As she spoke, Mary's memory flashed back to a rainy day 30 years ago vividly. It was shortly after Mary had been assigned to a local child welfare center. An urgent call came from the Carpenter family. We need you to come immediately. A homeless child has trespassed on our property. We'll have to call the police otherwise. Mary, please go. Understood. When Mary arrived, she witnessed an unexpected scene in a corner of the Carpenter family's garden. Elizabeth Carpenter, known as a wealthy matron, was comforting a homeless girl, draping her own jacket over the child. "This child has been coming to the garden for the past 3 days," Elizabeth explained quietly. "I've been watching silently. But today, with the rain." The girl was about 10 years old. Clutching the umbrella Elizabeth had handed her, she sipped warm soup. "Everyone says I'm an oddball," Elizabeth said with a wry smile. "Opening the Carpenter family's garden to homeless children. But," she looked at the girl and continued in a gentle voice, "these children need a safe place. Even if it's only temporary, a shelter from the rain and wind." Mary could never forget the look in Elizabeth's eyes at that moment. Raised in affluence yet possessing a deep understanding and empathy for the disadvantaged, Elizabeth's presence profoundly influenced Mary's life. Afterward, the two women clicked and decided to open the garden as a sanctuary for children. Elizabeth continued the initiative, even against her husband's objections. "I have a daughter I love," Elizabeth said one day, holding young Lily in her arms. "That's why I believe every child deserves to be showered with love." However, her kindness also deepened her isolation within her family. Her husband and brother-in-law vehemently criticized her activities, accusing her of tarnishing the Carpenter family's dignity. Elizabeth continued to wait in the garden for the children, rain or shine, and Mary worried as Elizabeth's cough grew progressively worse. "Elizabeth, you should rest." "It's okay, Mary. These children need someone to wait for them." That winter was particularly harsh. Elizabeth was found collapsed in the garden in the middle of the night. Suffering from severe pneumonia due to long hours in the cold and exhaustion, she was rushed to the hospital. Mary was shocked by Elizabeth's frail appearance in the hospital bed. Due to the strife with her husband, she had been unable to eat properly at home. The warm meals she had prepared for the children were made at the expense of her own portions. "I should have noticed," Mary reproached herself, "that your condition had deteriorated so much. It's not your fault, not at all." In her final moments, Elizabeth squeezed Mary's hand and said, "Please take care of my daughter, Lily. She surely has the same heart as me." Now, watching Lily's tears, Mary was certain Elizabeth's warm heart had indeed been passed down to her daughter. "Your mother was a truly special person," Mary said quietly. "Her inability to ignore those in need, that kindness, is exactly what you have." Tears of a new kind welled up in Lily's eyes, not of sadness, but seemingly of joy from feeling connected to her mother. "About 6 months after my mother passed, my father also suddenly," Lily traced back through her memories. "He had suffered a heart attack." 4-year-old Lily was then taken in by her uncle Robert, who had no children of his own. His wife, Martha, seemed welcoming at first. "For the first few weeks, she doted on me as if I were a doll," Lily said with a wry smile. But that didn't last long. Robert and Martha did not live in the house. Instead, they took Lily to a luxury apartment in the city center. "My uncle said the house was cursed. You must never go near it," he told me. Mary looked at Lily's profile, sensing the loneliness and isolation the young girl must have felt, which still lingered in her heart. "But it's strange," Lily continued, looking over the garden. "Even after leaving this house, I always remembered the scent of my mother's garden. The smell of the earth after rain, the freshness of new sprouts, the gentle fragrance of flowers. It was my precious connection to my mother. And yesterday, when I visited this garden for the first time in years, I smelled exactly that, my mother's garden. Lily smiled, her gaze settling on Jake quietly watering the soil in the greenhouse. The sight of him nurturing new life was a quiet testament to a truth that transcended 30 years. I came here indeed for Jake. Lily looked again at the boy. But not just for him. I have another precious memory here. Do you remember? Mary asked gently. Only bits and pieces. But I distinctly remember the kind social worker who took me in, right here in this greenhouse. Tears welled up in Mary's eyes. The days she had spent comforting a grieving young girl vividly came back to her. Legally, this land might belong to me. Lily continued quietly. But what I want to protect is not the ownership. It's the healing power of this garden. Suddenly, Jake spoke up in a small voice. I want to protect it too. Both women looked at him in surprise. He was still gazing at the soil, but his voice carried a firm resolve. When this tomato grows, can I plant other vegetables too? Mary smiled warmly. Of course, Jake. This greenhouse is a place for nurturing your dreams. As the evening light gently illuminated the greenhouse, Mary felt the healing of two souls steadily progressing. Yet, she also sensed the storm that was brewing in the near future. 2 weeks later, Pleasantville was enveloped in an unusual tension. Posters for Caroline's development project, bearing the slogan "Towards a New Future," began appearing all over town. The artist's impression of a luxury residential area was depicted under the slogan. Mary's garden was at the heart of those plans. We should proceed with formal legal actions. Lily and Mary discussed with Marcus Stein, a lawyer who had been involved in the Carpenter family's inheritance issues as a young attorney 30 years ago. I've reviewed all the documents from that time, Marcus explained as he opened an old file. Elizabeth Carpenter had set up this land and house as a trust for you. At that time, she nominated Mary as the manager of the facility. But after my Uncle Robert. Lily's voice trembled. Yes. After your parents' death, Robert Carpenter, her brother, took you in at the age of 4 and placed this land under his management. However, he had no rights to sell or dispose of it. And fatefully, the documents Mary discovered are exactly the proof of that decision. The development plan Caroline was trying to push forward is legally invalid. Marcus continued quietly. Because this land was entrusted to you to continue as a facility for children. Mary listened silently to their conversation. After 30 years, the documents she had found by chance were about to reveal Elizabeth's true intentions. It was a testimony to the deep love of a mother trying to protect both her wounded children and her beloved daughter. After Robert's death 10 years ago, the situation remained complicated. He had tried to sell the land rights to several real estate companies in his lifetime, creating a mess. In the midst of that chaos, your family came to live here. I still remember those days vividly. Mary spoke quietly. At that time, the facility's director suggested I live here as a caretaker. That was supposed to be a temporary measure until the rights issues surrounding the land were resolved. Marcus added. However, due to the complex rights issues, it has remained that way to the present. Did my mother foresee this too? Lily's voice was filled with emotion. By having Mary continue to live here, ensuring this place remains a facility for children. Mary looked out the window. This house had given her a new mission. Perhaps Elizabeth's deep intentions were being realized in this way. It really would be wonderful if that were true. Mary showed a moment of lightheartedness, but soon her expression turned to worry. However, the legal procedures will surely take time. In the meantime, my daughter might do something. Yes, she has already started moving. Marcus informed her in a grave tone. She's lobbying the town council to push forward with the redevelopment of this area. At that moment, the greenhouse door opened, and Jake entered. In his hand, he clutched a small notebook. "What's wrong?" Mary asked gently. "This." Jake shyly offered the notebook. On the opened page, there were detailed observations of vegetables. The date the sprouts emerged, the day the first true leaves unfolded, the length of the stems, everything was meticulously recorded. In the margins, there was a list of vegetables he wanted to grow next. "That's wonderful, Jake," Mary said, genuinely moved. "The teachers at the facility praised me too," the boy said bashfully. For the first time, someone acknowledged my effort. Tears welled up in Lily's eyes. The boy who had spoken to no one 2 weeks ago had changed so much. However, this warm atmosphere did not last long. "Well, what a lovely gardening club." Caroline entered the greenhouse with several men in suits. "This is trespassing," Mary stated firmly. "Not at all," Caroline retorted with a triumphant smile. "These gentlemen are town appraisers. It's necessary to inspect the safety of this building as part of the development plan." Jake instinctively stood in front of the tomato seedlings. His action struck Mary's heart. "Caroline." Lily stepped forward. "We have something that we must show you." She took some documents from Marcus and handed them to Caroline. "This is..." Caroline's expression changed. "These are official inheritance documents," Marcus explained. "They prove the complete transfer of rights from Elizabeth Carpenter to her daughter, Lillian Carpenter." Caroline scanned the documents, her complexion gradually changing. "This is a forgery." "Such a thing." "It's not a forgery," Marcus said calmly. "I was personally present at their creation." "But..." "The land rights you acquired were illegitimately obtained by Robert Carpenter." Lily's voice trembled yet held firm resolve. "He stole my mother's inheritance from me when I was 4. Caroline could not hide her confusion. The appraisers behind her began to shuffle uneasily. Then, an unexpected voice spoke up. "Why try to destroy it?" Jake addressed Caroline directly, his voice small but filled with firm strength. "This place is important. It heals broken hearts, repairs someone's spirit. This place..." Jake paused, his voice faltering as he gently squeezed the soil in his hands. "For me, it's the first place where I felt safe." He seemed surprised by his own words, then continued quietly. "Mrs. Williams doesn't get angry when I'm silent. She doesn't blame me when I break something. She just watches over me." The emotion in the boy's voice overflowed, perhaps more than he had ever shown before. His days nurturing the small lives in the greenhouse had subtly changed him. "Seeing something grow in this soil is what I need now. Jake." Mary instinctively placed her hand on the boy's shoulder. "I too," Lily spoke quietly, "was saved in this greenhouse 30 years ago. After losing someone I loved, Mary gave me hope to live. Now, I want to help children who are hurt, just like Jake." Caroline, listening to Jake and Lily, felt a different perspective on her mother's 30 years of work in the greenhouse. Jake's words seemed to have unlocked a door to emotions she had long sealed away. "Mom." Caroline's voice trembled faintly. "I just wanted to protect you." "But really?" She choked on her words and took a deep breath. "I'm still angry. Even when Dad died, you were with other children. I was alone, all alone." Tears streamed down her face. The facade of the professional woman slipped, revealing the girl underneath. Caroline. Mary moved closer, but Caroline stepped back. I tried to sell this house. Caroline paused, searching for words as she briefly closed her eyes. Pretending to be a concerned daughter doing the right thing. But really, I was wrong. In the end, I was just like when I was a child. I didn't try to understand what was important to you, I just denied it. Mary felt, perhaps for the first time, the depth of her daughter's pain. I'm sorry. Mary's voice also trembled. I should have been there for you. I should have realized how scared and lonely you were after Dad died. But you didn't. You went to other children, as always. Fresh tears welled up in Caroline's eyes. When I was a child, I often watched from outside this greenhouse. She said, gazing out the window. I saw the kind face Mom showed to unfamiliar children. I was jealous of those children, and at the same time, I despised them. That's why I was desperate to succeed. I wanted to prove to my mother that I too was important. But in the end, I just chased after money and status. Mary slowly took her daughter's hand. This time, Caroline did not pull away. You've always been my pride. Mary looked into her daughter's eyes. I just couldn't express it properly. My sense of justice, how much it hurt you, the most important thing to me. Mom. Things will be different now. Other children are important, but you are my irreplaceable daughter. I will never leave you alone again. Caroline felt the weight of emotions she had carried for years gradually beginning to dissolve. Hey, Carol. Can we protect this greenhouse together? Mary asked gently, with affection, as if speaking to her daughter when she was young. Utilize your business talent and my experience. As a new form of facility. Mother and daughter, after a long silence, finally touched each other's true feelings. It might not have been a complete reconciliation, but it was a definite step towards building a new relationship. Soft afternoon light filtered through the greenhouse. The young leaves of the tomatoes Jake had planted shimmered in the light. Mary's suggestion made Caroline look down quietly. The banker in her was still calculating in the back of her mind. The property value of the land, the profits after development, and her concern for her mother, all intertwined complexly. Yet, Jake's words lingered in her ears, a safe place. What about making this facility a corporation? Caroline suggested. That's a good idea, Mary responded, sensing her daughter's change. But it's difficult for me alone. I have no experience in management. If we set it up as a non-profit social welfare corporation, we could benefit from tax incentives. Caroline continued, almost as if convincing herself. We could also accept donations and secure operational funding. She looked into her mother's eyes and smiled. Using Mom's dream and my skills. Caroline showed a true smile for the first time in a long while. It will surely become a wonderful place. Mary continued the conversation, and the two nodded to each other. Then Caroline straightened her back and spoke firmly. I will cancel the appraisal. Let's go back. After Caroline and the appraisers left, an unusual stillness lingered in the greenhouse. However, it was not a heavy silence but one filled with the promise of a new beginning. As spring grew stronger each day, remarkable changes were occurring in the greenhouse. Jake's tomatoes had grown robustly, and next to them, a neat row of various vegetable seedlings, cucumbers, eggplants, peppers, each tagged and meticulously observed by the boy. Jake, they're growing beautifully, Mary said as she entered the greenhouse, and the boy beamed with a rare smile. Mary, look. He proudly pointed at the row of vegetables. I decided on this arrangement by considering the sunlight exposure. You've done your research well. Yeah. I borrowed some gardening books from the library. Jake answered shyly. Lily helped me. Then the greenhouse door opened again, and Caroline entered. Since last week's events, she had completely withdrawn her development plans. Today, she came alone and dressed casually. Mom, I have something to tell you. Mary read a serious decision in her daughter's expression. I've decided to quit the bank. Really? Mary exclaimed in surprise. I've thought a lot about it. Chasing just money and status. Caroline continued, choosing her words carefully. But what I saw here changed my values. She looked at Jake, who was still tending to the vegetables but clearly listening to the conversation. I want to create a facility here to support children. I'd like to ask for Lily's cooperation too. We were hoping to hear that. Lily entered the greenhouse with Marcus. She was holding a new stack of documents. Actually, we've also been planning something new. Lily said calmly. We want to officially turn this land into a rehabilitation facility for children. Caroline showed a surprised expression. Centering this greenhouse and garden, a place where children with emotional wounds can heal through interaction with nature. Lily explained passionately. Mary, as the director. Mary nodded strongly. Months later, on a summer afternoon, sunlight filled the greenhouse. The opening ceremony of the Garden Therapy Center was being held in Mary's garden. Centered around Mary's garden, the new facility had transformed into a place of healing for troubled children. Thank you all for gathering here today. Lily began her speech in front of the attendees. Next to her stood Mary, now the honorary director of the center. This place is where I was saved 30 years ago. As a descendant of the Carpenter family, I am truly delighted to be able to use this land in its rightful way. Caroline quietly nodded in the audience. She had chosen a new path, utilizing her managerial skills as a director of the facility's operations. Most importantly, I would like to introduce someone special who taught us the true value of this facility. Lily's gaze shifted toward the greenhouse, where Jake was teaching several children how to grow vegetables. The shadow that once clouded his expression had vanished, replaced by a confident young man. Jake, could you come here, please? The boy hesitated slightly before stepping forward, his posture straight. I've learned here. Jake began, his voice small yet clear. That plants will always respond if treated kindly. That hurting someone means hurting oneself. And he paused, looking toward Mary. Jake paused again, gently clutching the soil in his hands. I found my place for the first time in this garden. Planting seeds, watering them, waiting for the sprouts. The experience of someone quietly watching over my growth was the first for me. The venue was filled with a warm atmosphere. Tears shimmered in Mary's eyes. After the ceremony, the four gathered in the greenhouse. Jake's carefully tended tomato plants bore bright red fruits, perfectly timed for the opening ceremony. How about we all try these tomatoes? Mary suggested, and Jake began to carefully pick the tomatoes. His movements were decisive, showing a small pride in serving the vegetables he had nurtured. As the evening light bathed the greenhouse in red, the four shared the fresh tomatoes. Delicious. The flavor transcended mere vegetables, tasting of a new beginning. Hey, Mom. Caroline spoke quietly as she savored a tomato. I finally understand the true value of this garden. I'm glad you see it. Mary took her daughter's hand. Lily. Jake suddenly addressed her. Can I also plant some flower seeds next? Of course. Lily smiled warmly. What kind of flowers are you thinking of? Daisies. The boy answered without hesitation. The same flowers I saw from the basement. But this time, I want to grow strong flowers that no one can trample. Mary quietly observed the scene unfolding before her. After 30 years, this garden had found an even greater purpose. A place to bring new seasons to wounded hearts. A place to slowly regain lost trust. The setting sun reflecting off the greenhouse glass seemed to envelop them in a blessing, as if celebrating their new beginnings.